everybody. Now, if we don't pay attention to our spiritual life, there's always the danger of falling into a period of spiritual dryness. I personally have had spiritual dry spells, and I noticed there's a kind of recipe, so-called a recipe for falling into spiritual dryness. First, internally, you switch on the autopilot switch in your mind or in your spirit. You know how we can easily fall into a routine in our daily life. When you go through your day performing automated behaviors while your thoughts wander from the task at hand. So that's why you see people, checking their phones as they're walking to the bus stop or to the train station, and you see people in the office having music in their ear while they're typing away, just like autopilot. Now, spiritually, we can be on autopilot too. We can be faithful in church attendance, we can serve God, and yet be indifferent about our spiritual development. And the reasons for being on autopilot differ. But it could originate from a time of busyness, distraction, maybe even disinterest, and quite often exhaustion, and etc. All these can make us misplace our priorities. And the thing about being on autopilot is that we do not reflect much on our real needs. We are just moving by habit like a robot, and we don't realize we are getting spiritually parched or even hungry. And next thing you know, you find yourself in the middle of the dry desert, and your soul is thirsty and parched and just it's starving. Now let me read. Actually, I want to read from Isaiah 35 today. It's poetic and it describes a desert coming to life. Now, in real life, many of us have not been to a desert. We have heard of the Sahara Desert, but I don't know of anyone who has walked or even driven through a part of the Great Sahara Desert, which is, by the way, the largest hot desert in the world. The largest deserts are actually in the Arctic or the Antarctica, but the largest hot desert is in the Sahara. And would you believe it is 9.2 square kilometers big? That's huge, right? But even though we have not had the experience of being in a desert, I think we can imagine how difficult it is to live there or to find a way out of it, because there are just sand dunes everywhere. And we may look for footprints, but there are none to be found. The ancient Israelites were taken into exile, and their nation laid in ruins. And God described the Israelites and all of us who are spiritually dry as being in the desert, the wilderness. Sure, you can get used to being in the desert. You can get used to being parched. You can get used to the hot, arid desert air. Some people say, I can just become a spiritual camel and I'll just survive on the reserve spiritual food I have accumulated all through the years until we can drink or eat again. Or the best way, we ask God to refresh us. Prophet Isaiah makes contrast between chapter 34 and chapter 35 in his book. In chapter 34, the prophet uses apocalyptic imagery to describe the once lush and beautiful land of Edom becoming a desolate desert, a place where the jackals live, and people are dying or they are already dead, and the rocky crags are flowing with blood. It's not an easy read, chapter 34, and even the cosmos is going to be undone. And all these points to the day of the Lord, the day of judgment. Now, we all have a tendency to play down the subject of the wrath of God. we don't really want to read about it. We don't really want to talk about it. But the Bible does not shy away from this topic. And the Old Testament prophets certainly didn't shy away from this. And Jesus, in his grace, also didn't try to tone it down. In his final sermon in Matthew 24 and 25, Jesus talks about the separation of people. Some to life, and some cast away into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So it's not a good thing to think about, but it is true, because that's what Jesus describes. That's what Jesus warns us is going to happen. But whenever we are with our unbelieving family members or friends, the subject hardly comes up. We are more likely to ask them about their health. We're going to ask them how is their business, how are their children, or their vacation plans, more than about their need to be saved and to escape hell. It could be because we feel that the wrath of God and the judgment, and his judgment is incompatible with the idea of a loving and gracious God. And perhaps we think that God's anger is kind of similar to our own quick-temperedness or our short bursts of rage. But God's anger is not like the anger of man. And because God is holy, sin demands his judgment. And that's the reason why Jesus came. He came to die to bear the wrath of God on his body on our behalf. It's not like God hasn't provided a way of escape or a way of redemption for men. And we must understand that for God to be good and holy, he must hate evil and he must judge it. So in contrast to chapter 34, we have chapter 35 of Isaiah, and I'll read verses 1 to 8. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Verse 3, strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Verse 5, behold, our God, your God, will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. And verse 8, and a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. Wonderful reading of this passage. As I said, it's a very stark contrast from the previous chapter of decay and death. Here we have a description of the desert becoming a flourishing landscape. And there are blossoms, abundance of crocus flowers. The crocus is a symbol of renewal and hope. Commentator Young says this, where it had once been dried up land, there shall be springs of waters. Where there was desert wasteland and sadness, we shall find abundant life, joy, and rejoicing. And Isaiah goes from the promise of the flourishing of the dry land to offering encouragement and promises of salvation to the faint-hearted. He says, be strong, don't be anxious. And we see the weak, the sick, the blind being healed, and water breaking forth in the desert. The lame man leaps like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. God is showing that where there was drought, death, and decay, Now there is an abundance of life. Now, why was this message given? Because even though Judah had broken the covenant with God, God would remain faithful, and they are now living in exile. There's suffering and sadness. They feel weak and there is no hope. They feel distant from God. They must have felt like they were at death's door. And in their despair, God was giving them a message of hope. He paints them a picture so completely different from what they were experiencing. And it must have been quite hard for them to imagine that even coming true. How can they get out of the desert? Or how can there ever be life in the desert? It's the same for us when we are experiencing sorrow and suffering. It's hard to have hope. It's hard to see beyond the present circumstances. But remember that when the ancient Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, and they were made to wander there for so long because of their own unbelief, yet God, in His grace, was present with them in the desert. So yes, if you or I find ourselves in the middle of a spiritual dry spell, let's not say we want to be camels, but let's remember that the Lord is with us. And I like what another commentator said. His name is Oswald. He said, the way of man is to make the inhabited uninhabitable. The way of God, however, is to take the barren and make it abundant. I read that again. The way of man is to make the inhabited uninhabitable. The way of God is to take the barren and make it abundant. May God transform the spiritual parched wilderness of our hearts into fertile, blossoming abundance. And the Lord bless you. Let us always walk with Him. Let us not allow ourselves to go into autopilot spiritually. Amen.